Okay. Good morning again, everybody. So I'm not exactly going to talk about this one scripture I'm going to start with, but it's kind of a wonderful stepping off point for where I'm going. And it's from the second letter to Timothy. I'm just going to read a really short passage from for it because it's so beautiful. And in fact, in many of the epistles, the letters that Paul supposedly wrote to the various churches, the epistles in the New Testament and the Christian scriptures, and many of them, he has these kinds of blessings that he offers the people that he's writing. So he says, I thank God when I remember you constantly in my prayers. As I remember your tears, I long night and day to see you, that I may be filled with joy. I'm reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I am sure dwells in you. I remind you to rekindle the gift of God that is within you. For God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but a spirit of power and love and self control. From the first chapter of the second letter to Timothy. So I'm going to speak today primarily about a woman from the Hebrew scriptures. Um, I have never heard anybody speak a sermon about this woman. If you have, I would love to hear it, hear what you heard. And you may not even know her name. She's not a very well known person, but she's got a good story to tell, a story that will teach us lessons. Her name was Rahab, Rahab. Anybody heard of her name anyway? One. Okay. Jody and Zach and Bob, are you familiar with her name? Yes. Okay. Well, anyway, the unfortunate part about Rahab was throughout the history, she had a nickname that was a really ugly nickname. She was called Rahab the Harlot. So now let me tell you about her. Her story is found in the book of Joshua, which, let's see, I need to back up and tell you what about the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua is a recounting of some of the things that happened to the Israelite people after Moses had led them. Remember, Moses led them away from Egypt where they had been in bondage and enslaved, and they were trying to escape the Pharaoh who was not just insulted but furious that the Israelite people believed in Yahweh God, the God of the universe. The reason the Pharaoh was so insulted by that was because in that time, the Pharaoh was considered God Almighty, and everyone was required to pay obeisance to him and to worship him and to obey anything he said and to never question him. Well, that didn't set well with the Pharaoh, that there was this group of slaves in his kingdom that didn't believe he was God, and they wouldn't bow down to him and they wouldn't honor him. And eventually it became, as you may recall, all out war between the Israelites and Pharaoh and his soldiers. And so the short story is, and I know you remember this part, so the Israelites, being led by Moses, um, escaped barely with the skin on their backs from the soldiers chasing after them on their horses to kill them, or at least to capture them and bring them back to slavery to work for the Pharaoh. And they went through, you remember this part. They went through this raging river, which is mistranslated as the Red Sea. It was really the Reed Sea, and you know all that in the story. And I don't know how much of it is true, but it's based on truth. I just don't know how much of it actually happened. But it's based on truth that the Israelites were trying to get to a place where they could worship God safely and where they would have some land of their own and where they could take care of themselves. Okay, that sets up the story of what happened before the book of Joshua. So if you may recall, they had been aimlessly wandering around trying to find food and water, and God created miracles for them, and it had been going on for many years, and they still hadn't found where. It was kind of like me trying to follow directions. Anyway, they couldn't seem to get where they were supposed to go, and you think I'm kidding. Anyway, they got almost to what was considered the promised land. They needed to cross another river. But Moses, if you recall, at some point earlier, had disobeyed God. And so God told Moses, you're going to be able to lead your people up to the promised land, but you are not going to be allowed to go in. And your successor will be Joshua. So then they had to continue to try to make their way and survive until an entire generation of the Israelites had passed away. And then they were in a place spiritually and physically, geographically, that they were going to be able to go into the quote promised land, which was called Canaan, Canaan. I spell things because I remember them better if I can see the word. So they had to cross the Jordan River because the Jordan River was a very fertile, well, like any river. Remember, most of the area where they lived and where they wandered was just desert and rocks and barren and very difficult to live. And they obviously, if they were going to settle somewhere and be able to take care of their families, they needed water, they needed to be able to grow crops, they needed to be able to have grazing area for their animals, and that just wasn't happening out in the middle of the desert. And remember the other thing I told you one time. Remember when it says they did it for 40 years? Remember what I told you 40 means? It just means a long, long time. That's all it means. It's not a specific calendar event. So don't ever take the numbers literally. But it was a long, long time. And the Jordan River, after they crossed the Jordan River, that was the entrance into the city of Jericho, which was the entrance into all of the promised land. So they had to get across the Jordan River, and then they had to get into Jericho. You all remember the old song about Jericho? We're not going to sing it, but Joshua fought the battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. Well, that's a pretty remarkable story that I also don't believe actually happened, but supposedly some of the soldiers and some of the other Israelites walked around this giant city that was walled, huge walls, thick, tall walls surrounded by a moat filled with water. It had taken who knows how many years to make the bricks and build the walls. This was pretty much an impenetrable city, and according to the legend, they marched around the walls for 7 days in a row and made a lot of racket, and on the seventh day the walls just fell. I don't think so. I don't think so, but it's a nice song. Anyway, and I hope I'm not offending anybody by my I'm not making light of the scriptures. I'm just saying, when this stuff was written down, and this is really important, when the material in the Hebrew scriptures was written down. Uh-oh. When the Did you hear my dog? He's barking. I hope there's nobody. I hope I don't have to go outside. When the material in the scriptures was written down, it was written down many hundreds of years after whatever happened. So the people that were writing it down had a purpose, and their main purpose was to convince folks of God's power and fidelity. So some of these things that don't seem like they probably could have happened were to make the point of God's power and fidelity. So let's just pretend that the walls came tumbling down, but they didn't. But then we get to Rahab. Okay, so here the people that lived in Jericho were of a completely different culture and completely different spiritual traditions than the Israelites. And not to say that all of them, it wasn't like it wasn't like everybody believed the same thing in Canaan, because they didn't. But historically, the archaeologists know pretty much with certainty that the people in that city, in Jericho, practiced some horrible practices, among which were child sacrifice and temple prostitutes. Well, you can see why the Israelites would have been offended by that. So the only way the Israelites could get into the city and kind of scope it out and see how safe it was going to be for them to try to take over part of the land and be able to live there was to send spies in. So Joshua picked out a couple of spies from his camp of men, and he said, "Now I need you to get into the city and just do a reconnaissance and find out what's going on, so we'll have an idea of what we're facing when we get there." This was supposedly before the walls fell down. Well, as I said, it's a walled city, and so during the daylight there were huge gates that were open, and there was a drawbridge across the moat, and people could come and go at will. But at night they closed everything up, so it was literally impossible to get in or out. So the two Israelites went into the city, and the verses about Rahab, there aren't many of them, but from what we know of the history and the culture and so forth, this is what most assuredly happened. The two spies got in, and it was okay, and somehow they learned about this woman Rahab, who was called the harlot. Rahab was an innkeeper. She had a house. She lived inside the wall. And I'm thinking, how do you live inside a wall? Well, the wall was, as far as I can tell, it wasn't solid. And there were two walls that were parallel to each other that encircled the whole city, both walls. And apparently there were some houses that were built between the walls, and they built with some sort of planks or something. They made a walkway between the walls and set a house on it. And Rahab had a house that was ideally located for the Israelites' purpose, because she had a window that faced out of the city. And most people would, first of all, they wouldn't have even been able to see out of the city because of the walls. And secondly, they likely wouldn't have a window. So somehow they learned that this innkeeper had a room to rent, and they could stay there. So that's what I think happened. I in no way believe that Rahab was a harlot. I believe that because she was a single woman without a husband and without a son to, quote, take care of her, she was belittled. And it still happens today to single women who don't have a husband or sons. And sometimes people just are ugly. um, but she needed to be able to have some money to take care of herself. So she had a room in her house that she rented out for people that came into Jericho and needed a place to stay. So the two Israelite spies go to Rahab, and here's one of the amazing things that happened. She knew before they didn't tell her what they were there for. She knew she had a vision. I don't know, but she knew that they were people who loved God, and she said to them, "I know Yahweh. I know Yahweh, your God, and I honor him, and I know how he helped you get across the Reed Sea." Now, the only way I can figure out that she knew that is that I think she had some sort of mystical experience. And I I'm guessing that all of us here today have had some sort of mystical experience where we felt a oneness with the universe and with the divine, and it was so intense and it was so beyond anything we ever had happened to us before. But we knew that something remarkable and holy had happened. So I think that's how Rahab knew who these men were. So she realized why they were there. And she said, "You have got to be really careful, or the people here in Jericho will kill you." So she said, "I need you after dark tonight. I need you to go up on the roof of my house. And we just harvested a lot of the grain and the barley." And she said, "I have a whole large pile of flax up on my roof that I'm drying to use to make things with and to sell." She said, "Hide underneath there until I come to get you." So they did that, and sure enough, some of the soldiers from Canaan, from Jericho, came up to her house and wanted to know, "Have you seen these Israelite spies?" And she said, "I did see them. They were running. I looked out my window, and they were running across over the moat, and they ran, and I saw them head towards the river, the Jordan River." Well, guess what? They went out running, chase off these guys that weren't anywhere near the Jordan River. So at some point after dark, Rahab had a rope that she'd probably woven from the flax, and she was able to lower it out of her window and let the men escape safely. And they went back to Joshua and told Joshua what they had discovered. And that and before the men left, though, she said, "You have to promise me. You have to promise me this." She said, "I have helped you, but they're going to kill me and all my family if any of the if any of the citizens of Jericho find out that I helped you, and I believe in you, and I believe in your God, you have to promise me that you will keep me and my parents and my sisters and my brothers safe. They said, yes, we will. They said, when we enter the city, you make sure that all of your loved ones are sheltered with you inside your house and you don't come out until we give you the signal that it's safe. And in order for us to be able to find your house, so that all of us will know which house to leave alone and not attack, you hang a cord from your window that you've dyed with red dye, and we'll be able to see it as we enter the city. So that's what happened. Now, there's so much of the Hebrew scriptures that's so distressing. And Joshua, I'm here to warn you, is just unbelievable amounts of violence and bloodshed and horror. And remember, I told you that the folks that wrote this material down, who knows how long after it actually happened, whatever happened, they had as their main purpose to convince people of God's power and strength. This is what I think. I don't think God ever told anybody to go somewhere and slaughter every single living being. I absolutely do not believe that. Any time, any place, any people. But that's what it says. And it was a way for whoever was writing this down to emphasize the faithfulness of the Israelites, that they would do anything that God commanded. I don't believe that it happened that way. And we can look in the history of our own country and see times when the Europeans, especially, have attacked and brutalized other people from other cultures, and it's still going on today. So we know that, unfortunately, that's just part of the human history. At any rate, Rahab and her family were saved, and that is the beginning of the story of the Israelites being in the promised land and how they were able to renew and recover and have a place to live and water and food and crops. So what about Rahab? What you may not know, or if you did know it, I'm going to remind you, there are several places throughout our Bible, Hebrew scriptures and Christian scriptures, that refer to Rahab, the harlot. And they're all complimentary of this woman, of her bravery, of her courage, of her faith in God, and of her willingness to help the Israelite people. In the Psalms, in a couple of the epistles, the letters of Paul to some of the other churches, in Hebrews, and in, this is the real surprising one, and in Matthew's genealogy of Christ. So some people would say that Rahab the harlot was a forebear of Jesus. Again, I think there was a lot of things going on with those genealogies. It's not necessarily exactly fact, but it was a way of making a point. But can you imagine Rahab, who wasn't a harlot, but she always had that reputation. An outsider. I mean, she was an outsider because she was an unmarried woman, because she was an innkeeper. Innkeepers, male or female, were looked upon with suspicion at that time. She was a believer in Yahweh in a city that absolutely didn't believe in the Lord God. She would have been an outsider when she joined ranks with the Israelites later because she wasn't an Israelite by birth. She was an outsider, and so to me it's almost like a sad sort of poetry that on top of all that she had to live in the wall outside the city, on the outside of the city. All that said, through generations and generations, people have been reminded of this woman and her faith in God and her courage. And I can guarantee you it never occurred to her that that would be her heritage. So it takes me back to that passage I read to you from the beginning from 2 Timothy. Every time I think of you, I am grateful. And I pray for you night and day. And please give your love to your mother and your grandmother and the other people in your life. Please give my love to them. And please hold firm with your faith in God. Perhaps it never occurred to any of us that even 50 years from now, somebody would remember any of us with that kind of gratitude. And certainly, I don't think it would occur to any of us that we would be remembered generations, perhaps centuries from now. But that's what happened for Rahab the harlot. You never know who God is going to use. And it's all of us. I'd like to sing a song for you right now that I think kind of sums this up. Pardon me while I move. This is called My Dedication. It's written by Claudel Hefner. And if you know it, feel free to sing in your homes. And if you don't know it, just listen. Here I am, Lord, use me, guide me, fill me, take me, lead me to your will. Here I am, Lord, ready to follow, to serve you, to love you, to be you in this world. Thy will is done this day. Thy will is done through me this day. Lord, you call, I answer. I'm ready to listen. I hear you, I feel you move in me. I come closer, humbled, surrendered, lifted, committed to your plan. Thy will is done through me this day. Thy will is done through me this day. Here I am, Lord,